In the terrifying sun-drenched spring of 1942, the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Theater had ceased to be a contested battleground and had transformed into a hunting preserve for the Imperial Japanese Navy, specifically for the pilots of the Mitsubishi A6M2-0, a fighter aircraft that was so technologically superior to its American counterparts that its very existence seemed to violate the laws of aerodynamics known to the West. To the young, fresh-faced American aviators like Ensign Baker, gripping the stick of his Grumman F-4F Wildcat with white-knuckled terror on a patrol vector near the Coral Sea, the intelligence briefings he had received at flight school felt like criminal negligence, for he had been told that the Japanese flew inferior copies of Western designs, rickety crates made of bamboo and paper that would crumble under the guns of American industry. The reality, however, was a shimmering silver nightmare that appeared out of the cloud deck at 20,000 feet, a machine that moved with the fluid, weightless grace of a swallow, while Baker's Wildcat wallowed through the air like a lead brick. As the flight of Zeros initiated their attack, diving out of the sun with their Nakajima Sakai engines humming a high-pitched, efficient drone, Baker instinctively did what every American pilot had been trained to do since the biplane dogfights of the First World War. He hauled back on the stick and kicked the rudder, attempting to turn inside the attacker to bring his guns to bear, a maneuver that was the foundational doctrine of aerial combat. It was a fatal mistake. As the heavy, armor-plated Wildcat groaned under the G-forces, bleeding airspeed and a shuddering turn that felt like steering a truck through mud, the Zero pilot behind him simply adjusted his bank angle with a flick of the wrist, his aircraft responding instantly to the control surfaces. The Japanese fighter didn't just turn, it pirouetted, cutting a tight, vicious circle that was half the radius of the American plane, slipping effortlessly onto Baker's tail in a display of agility that defied belief. Baker looked over his shoulder, sweat stinging his eyes, expecting to see the enemy struggling to keep up. But instead, he saw the broad gray nose of the Zero looming larger, its 7.7mm machine guns sparkling along the cowling, followed by the terrifying, thumping flash of the 20mm wing cannons. The tracers arced past his canopy, seeking the fuel tanks, and Baker realized with a sickening clarity that he was fighting a ghost. He couldn't outturn it, he couldn't outclimb it, and at this altitude, he couldn't even outrun it. The Wildcat was built like a tank, rugged and heavy, designed to survive punishment, while the Zero was built like a sword, stripped of all armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to achieve a power-to-weight ratio that allowed it to dance on the air. But Baker didn't know about the Zero's fragility, he only knew its dominance. His aircraft shuddered as the cannon shells tore into the fuselage, shredding the aluminum skin and shattering the instrument panel, the cockpit filling with the acrid smoke of burning insulation and the metallic taste of fear. He was trapped in a lethal geometry where every move he made only brought the enemy gun sights closer to his cockpit, a feeling of total helplessness that was being replicated across the entire Pacific, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. Back at the debriefing rooms in Pearl Harbor and aboard the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, the atmosphere was one of grim, hushed panic as the surviving pilots returned with hands that shook too much to hold a coffee cup, telling stories of a mystery fighter that could loop around them while they were still completing a turn. The intelligence officers staring at the after-action reports saw a statistical massacre. The kill ratio was lopsided to a degree that threatened the viability of the entire naval air arm. They realized that the Japanese had sacrificed pilot protection for performance, creating a specialized dogfighter that exploited the classic turn-and-burn tactics that American pilots held sacred. The Zero could climb at 3,000 feet per minute, leaving the Wildcat gasping below. It could fly for hours without refueling, appearing in skies that should have been safe, and in a twisting, turning dogfight, it was invincible. The morale of the U.S. Navy fighter squadrons began to fracture under the weight of this technological disparity, creating a psychological phantom known as Zero fever, where the mere silhouette of the Mitsubishi fighter was enough to induce a fatal hesitation. The admirals knew they couldn't build a new plane overnight, The F-6F Hellcat was still a blueprint on a desk in Long Island, and the F-4U Corsair was having carrier landing problems. They were stuck with the slow, heavy Wildcat, forcing them to send men like Ensign Baker into the sky to face a superior samurai sword with a clumsy iron bludgeon, hoping that somehow courage alone would bridge the gap in engineering. But as Baker's plane smoked and spiraled toward the ocean, the cold physics of war declared that courage was not enough. Unless someone could rewrite the geometry of the dogfight and find a way to negate the Zero's turning radius, the rising sun would own the sky forever, and the American fleet would be picked apart from above, one defenseless ship at a time. While the skies over the Pacific were being cleared of American aluminum by the superior aerodynamics of the Zero, the solution to the crisis was being forged not in a wind tunnel or a flight simulator, but on a scarred wooden table in a modest apartment in Coronado, California, where Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thach sat alone in the quiet hours of the night, staring at a handful of wooden matchsticks. Thach, the commander of Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, was a man who possessed the soul of an engineer wrapped in the uniform of an aviator. He was not prone to the swaggering fatalism of many fighter pilots who believed that skill and luck were the only currencies in war. Instead, he viewed the slaughter of the Wildcat pilots as a structural engineering failure that required a structural fix. He had read the confidential reports from the Battle of the Coral Sea and the raids on the Marshall Islands, dissecting the tragic narratives of men who had tried to dogfight the Zero and lost. He internalized the physics of the defeat. The Zero had a turning radius that was roughly 2/3 that of the Wildcat, meaning that in a traditional Lufbery circle, the defensive formation where planes flew in a ring to cover each other's tails, the Zeros could simply cut across the diameter of the circle and pick off the Americans one by one. The standard doctrine of turn into the attack was merely accelerating the inevitable execution. Thach realized with a chilling clarity that if the U.S. Navy continued to fight one-on-one, they would run out of pilots before the Japanese ran out of ammunition. On his table, Thach arranged the matchsticks to represent aircraft. He placed a red-tipped match, the Zero, behind a plain match, the Wildcat. He moved them through the standard maneuvers. If the Wildcat turned left, the Zero turned left, only tighter, maintaining the firing solution. If the Wildcat climbed, the Zero climbed faster. Every traditional move resulted in the plain match being swept off the table. Thach sat back, lighting a cigarette, the smoke curling in the lamplight as he stared at the stalemate. He realized that the weakness of the Wildcat, its inability to turn tightly, had to be compensated for by an external factor. He picked up a second plain match. The solution, he hypothesized, lay in the death of the lone wolf mentality. A single Wildcat was prey. Two Wildcats had to become a single integrated weapon system. He placed the two American matches side by side, but not in the tight formation used for parades. He spaced them wide apart, about the turning radius of a Wildcat. This was the beam defense position. Now he introduced the Zero. He moved the red match to attack the right-hand Wildcat. In the old doctrine, the right-hand plane would turn away or break hard, isolating itself. But Thach tried something counterintuitive, something that felt suicidal to a pilot's instinct. He moved the right-hand match to turn left, and simultaneously, he moved the left-hand match to turn right. The two American planes turned toward each other, their flight paths crossing like the blades of a pair of scissors. As he manipulated the matches, the geometry revealed itself with the elegance of a mathematical proof. When the Zero followed the right-hand Wildcat into the turn, it became fixated on its target, its pilot intent on the kill. However, by turning inward, the right-hand Wildcat was dragging the Zero directly across the nose of the left-hand Wildcat. The second American plane, simply by executing its turn,
found the Zero passing perfectly through its gun sights at a deflection angle that was nearly impossible to miss. The hunter had been lured into a trap. If the Zero switched targets to the other plane, the Weave simply reversed, and the first plane became the shooter. The maneuver created a self-protecting cell where no matter which plane the Zero attacked, it would expose its vulnerable flank to the wingman. Thach ran the simulation again and again, pushing the matchsticks until the wood was worn, trying to find a flaw in the logic. There was none. The maneuver negated the Zero's turning advantage because the Americans weren't trying to outturn the Japanese. They were using the turn to bring their partners' guns to bear. The next day, Thach took his theory to the sky, enlisting the help of a young, talented ensign named Edward or Butch O'Hare to test the concept over the desert. They flew the Weave repeatedly, with O'Hare playing the role of the Zero, trying to get a bead on Thach. Every time O'Hare committed to an attack, he looked up to find Thach's nose pointed directly at his cockpit. They realized they had discovered a tactical alchemy. They had turned a defensive retreat into an offensive slaughter. But teaching it to the fleet was a different challenge. The Thach Weave required a level of discipline and trust that was alien to the cowboy culture of fighter pilots. It meant looking away from the enemy to watch your wingman. It meant flying directly at a mid-air collision before breaking away at the last second. And most terrifyingly, it meant acting as live bait to lure a Zero onto your tail so your friend could shoot him off. Thach knew that diagrams on a tablecloth were one thing, but asking a 20-year-old kid to trust geometry while 20mm cannon shells were ripping apart his rudder was another. Yet, as the intelligence reports indicated a massive Japanese fleet moving towards a tiny atoll called Midway, Thach knew the time for theory was over. He gathered his pilots of VF-3 in the ready room, drew the scissoring lines on the chalkboard, and told them that their survival depended on an invisible knot they would tie in the sky, a knot that would either strangle the Zero or become their collective noose. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the theory of the matchsticks faced the brutal audit of reality in the airspace above the churning, blue-black waters of the Central Pacific, where the fate of the war hinged on the survival of a handful of American aircraft carriers. Lieutenant Commander John Thach sat in the cockpit of his F-4-F-4 Wildcat, listening to the radial engine roar as he circled high above the USS Yorktown. But his mind was not on the glory of combat. It was focused on the desperate mathematics of the mission. Thach and his small division of 6 fighters had been assigned the unenviable task of escorting Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3, whose slow, obsolete TBD devastators were plodding toward the Japanese fleet like cattle to a slaughterhouse. As they approached the enemy task force, Thach looked up and saw the nightmare scenario that every intelligence briefing had warned about. The sky above the Japanese carriers was a swirling anthill of Mitsubishi A6M20s, the Combat Air Patrol, or CAP, that protected the Emperor's fleet with a vicious efficiency. There were at least 20 of them glittering in the sun, poised to dive on Thach's 6 lumbering Wildcats. The odds were roughly 3-to-1, a ratio that, according to the previous months of the war, guaranteed the annihilation of the Americans. The attack, when it came, was a vertical avalanche of aluminum and fire. The Zeros, piloted by the elite veterans of the Kido Butai, dove with the confidence of men who had never lost a fight, expecting the Americans to do what they always did: panic, break formation, and scatter into a chaotic melee where the Zero's superior turning radius would pick them apart. Thach watched the lead elements of the Japanese formation scream down, their cannons flashing, and he keyed his microphone, his voice calm amidst the static. He didn't order a retreat, he ordered the beam defense position. His division split, widening out to the pre-planned distance, flying level and waiting for the blow. Thach's wingman, Ensign R.A. Ram Dibrell, was the first to be targeted. A Zero painted in the pale gray of the Imperial Navy latched onto Dibrell's tail, the Japanese pilot closing for the kill, salivating at the sight of the fat, slow Wildcat filling his gun sight. In any other battle, Dibrell would have been dead in seconds. But today, the script changed. Instead of turning away to flee, Dibrell banked hard, not away from the threat, but back toward Thach. Simultaneously, Thach banked hard toward Dibrell. The two Wildcats turned into each other, their flight paths converging at a frightening speed. To the Japanese pilot, this maneuver made no sense. It looked like a collision course. He kept his eyes locked on Dibrell, ignoring the second American plane that was sliding across his field of vision. This tunnel vision was his death sentence. As the two Wildcats crossed paths, separated by only a few hundred feet of air, Thach found himself looking directly at the belly of the Zero that was chasing his wingman. The geometry of the weave had delivered the enemy perfectly into his firing envelope. Thach squeezed the trigger, and his 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns hammered out a stream of incendiary death. The rounds smashed into the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks and engine cowling. There was no armor to spark off, no self-sealing bladder to absorb the damage. The Japanese fighter simply disintegrated, exploding into a ball of orange fire and debris that Thach flew right through, the heat washing over his canopy. It works, Thach realized with a jolt of adrenaline that was almost electric. My God, it actually works! But the test was not over. The Zeros, enraged and confused by the loss of their comrade, swarmed the small American formation. For the next 20 minutes, the sky became a tapestry of weaving contrails. Every time a Zero picked a target, the victim would drag the attacker across the nose of a wingman. The Thach Weave transformed the Wildcats into individual targets, into a self-repairing organic machine. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to fighting isolated opponents, found themselves constantly flying into a wall of lead, no matter which way they turned. They tried to loop, they tried to dive, but the Americans refused to play the turning game. They simply scissored back and forth, a deadly pendulum that swept the sky clean. Thach himself claimed 3 kills in the engagement, and his wingman accounted for several more. The Japanese, realizing that their prey had suddenly grown teeth, broke off the engagement, leaving the surviving Wildcats to limp back to the fleet. When Thach landed on the deck of the Yorktown, or later the Enterprise after Yorktown was hit, his plane was riddled with bullet holes, a testament to the ferocity of the fight, but he was alive, and more importantly, his squadron was largely intact. The blood test had been passed. As he climbed out of the cockpit, sweaty and exhausted, he wasn't just a survivor of the Battle of Midway, he was the bearer of a revelation. The myth of the invincible Zero had been shattered, not by a better engine or a bigger gun, but by a better idea. The matchsticks on the kitchen table had held the line against the samurai sword, proving that even a heavy, clumsy brick could fly like an ace if it was guided by the cold, hard logic of geometry.
By late 1942, the Thach Weave had migrated from the chalkboard of a squadron ready room to the official doctrine manuals of the United States Navy, transforming from a desperate improvisation into a standardized system of aerial execution. In the humid, corrugated steel hangars of the Kaneohe Naval Air Station in Hawaii, Lieutenant Commander John Thach stood before rows of fresh-faced replacement pilots, men who had been raised on the romanticized dogfighting stories of the Red Baron, and began the difficult work of reprogramming their survival instincts. The challenge was not teaching them how to fly, it was teaching them how to be bait. Thach paced before the diagram of the beam defense position, explaining that the maneuver was essentially a spring-loaded trap, but for the trap to snap shut, one pilot had to be willing to stick his head into the lion's mouth. This role, the sucker or the bait, required a terrifying discipline. When a Zero latched onto your tail, your job was not to shake him with violent aerobatics, which would only bleed your energy and leave you vulnerable. Your job was to drag him steadily across the sky, keeping your flight path predictable enough for the Japanese pilot to commit,
but dynamic enough to bring him into your wingman's sights. It was a request that went against every evolutionary impulse in the human brain, to trust an invisible partner behind you while a 20-millimeter cannon was turning your rudder into Swiss cheese. The efficacy of the weave lay in its exploitation of the fundamental cultural and engineering disparities between the two combatants. The Japanese naval aviators were the modern inheritors of the samurai tradition, trained in a doctrine that emphasized individual excellence, spiritual purity, and the duel. To a Zero pilot, an aerial battle was a series of one-on-one engagements where superior airmanship would inevitably triumph. They were virtuosos of the stick and rudder, flying aircraft that were extensions of their own bodies, stripped of heavy armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to maximize agility. When a Zero pilot saw an American fighter, he saw a clumsy opponent to be outmaneuvered. But the Thach Weave weaponized this arrogance. When the Japanese pilot attacked the bait Wildcat, he entered a tunnel of concentration, focused entirely on the deflection shot. He did not look for the second American plane, because his training did not emphasize the threat of a coordinated team. He expected the second plane to be fleeing or engaging another target. This blindness was structural. The Zero's cockpit offered poor rearward visibility compared to the Wildcat, and their radios were often of poor quality, making complex team coordination difficult. Thach taught his men to view the sky not as a dueling ground, but as a killing box defined by geometry. The beam defense position, two planes flying abreast separated by about 1,000 feet, looked like a loose, sloppy formation to the uninitiated, but it was actually a cocked pistol. As the weave began, the American pilots executed the scissoring turn. To the Japanese pilot on the tail of the first Wildcat, the sudden turn of his quarry looked like a panic maneuver, a desperate attempt to flee. He would tighten his turn to follow, pulling G's, smiling as he lined up the shot. He never saw the spring trap release. The second Wildcat, the shooter, was now cutting across the circle, approaching from the Zero's blind side at a 90-degree angle. This was the moment where the engineering fragility of the Mitsubishi A6 M2 met the brute force of the Browning M2 machine gun. The Zero was a beautiful kite made of duralumin, filled with high-octane gasoline. It had no armor plate behind the pilot seat and no rubber bladder to seal bullet holes in the wing tanks. It was built to dish out punishment, not to take it. As the shooter Wildcat brought its 4 or 6.5 caliber guns to bear, firing a stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, the result was often catastrophic. It didn't take a sustained burst to kill a Zero. It took a split-second intersection of trajectories. One moment the Zero was the predator. The next, a single tracer round would pierce a wing tank, and the vapors would ignite. The spring trap didn't just damage the enemy, it vaporized them. American pilots reported Zeros exploding with such violence that they looked like pyrotechnic displays, flaming coffins that disintegrated into burning confetti. The psychological impact on the Japanese air groups was devastating. The veteran aces, men who had terrorized the skies over China and the Philippines, began to vanish, shot down by clumsy American pilots who refused to dogfight properly. They couldn't understand how they were losing. Every time they latched onto a Wildcat, another one would seemingly materialize out of nowhere to blast them from the side. The invisible scissors began to snip away the elite cadre of the Imperial Navy one by one. Back in the training room, Thach erased the chalk lines and looked at the young pilots, seeing the dawn of understanding in their eyes. They realized that they didn't need a better plane to win. They just needed to trust the man flying next to them. The lone wolf was dead. The age of the Wildcat had begun, and the Zero, for all its grace and speed, was about to become an endangered species in a sky that had been reclaimed by the cold, hard logic of teamwork.
By the summer of 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific sky had shifted so violently that it resembled a different war entirely, one where the hunters had become the hunted, and the invincible Zero had been reduced to a fragile antique. The catalyst for this transformation was the arrival of the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a machine that was the physical embodiment of the lessons learned in blood during the dark days of 1942. The Hellcat was not a desperate improvisation like the Wildcat. It was a predator designed with a specific genetic purpose: to kill Zeros. It was faster, it could outclimb the Mitsubishi fighter at all altitudes, and it was armored like a flying tank, capable of absorbing punishment that would have disintegrated a Japanese plane. Yet, despite this overwhelming technological superiority, the United States Navy did not abandon the lessons of the kitchen table. The Thach Weave had ceased to be a defensive maneuver born of desperation and had evolved into an offensive doctrine of total dominance. The pilots sitting in the cockpits of the Hellcats were no longer the frightened novices of the Coral Sea. They were the lethal graduates of a system that prioritized teamwork over individual glory, and they carried John Thach's invisible geometry with them into the greatest aerial battle in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19, 1944, the Japanese mobile fleet, desperate to halt the American invasion of Saipan, launched a massive airstrike consisting of hundreds of aircraft, believing that the spirit of the samurai would overcome the material numbers of the enemy. But the Japanese pilots in the cockpits were not the veterans of Pearl Harbor. Those men were dead, killed off in the attrition battles of the Solomons by the grinding efficiency of the Thach Weave and the Allied war machine. These new pilots were barely trained teenagers with fewer flight hours than an American cadet, flying Zeros that had barely changed since 1940. As they approached the American fleet, they flew into a buzzsaw that would become known grimly as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The American Combat Air Patrol, directed by radar and waiting at high altitude, descended upon the Japanese formation with a coordinated violence that was clinical in its execution. The Hellcat pilots, flying in the beam defense pairs that Thach had devised, engaged the Zeros not as duelists but as executioners. When a rookie Japanese pilot attempted to engage a Hellcat, falling back on the turn-fighting dogma he had been rushed through in flight school, he found that the American plane simply refused to play his game. The Hellcat would drag him into a trap, and before he could complete his turn, the wingman would slice across his path, the 6.50 caliber machine guns tearing the flimsy Zero apart. The weave, combined with the Hellcat's speed, created a killing zone from which there was no escape. It wasn't a dogfight, it was industrial pest control. The sky rained burning duralumin as nearly 300 Japanese aircraft were swatted out of the air in a single afternoon, a loss of such catastrophic magnitude that the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Among the officers coordinating this slaughter from the flag bridge of the carrier Lexington, CV-16, was Commander John Thach, now the operations officer to Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Watching the radar plots and listening to the jubilant radio chatter of the pilots, hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot, Thach felt a profound sense of validation that went beyond personal pride. He realized that the matchsticks on the kitchen table had done more than just save a few Wildcat pilots. They had fundamentally rewritten the DNA of naval aviation. The concept of mutual support, the idea that two planes acting as one unit are infinitely stronger than two planes acting alone, had replaced the romantic, aristocratic notion of the ace. The Zero had failed not just because it lacked armor or self-sealing tanks, but because it was a weapon designed for a bygone era of individual heroism. It was a sword fighting against a machine gun. In the years that followed, as the war moved inexorably toward Tokyo, the Thach Weave remained the standard operating procedure for the U.S. Navy, adapted for the F-4U Corsairs and even the jet fighters that would follow decades later. The legacy of the maneuver was not just in the wreckage of the Zeros littering the floor of the Pacific Ocean, but in the mindset of every pilot who learned to check his wingman's 6 o'clock before checking his own. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, ended the war as a tragic anachronism, a beautiful, deadly dancer that had been outthought by a simple engineer who saw the sky as a geometry problem. As the sun set on the American fleet in Tokyo Bay in 1945, the victory belonged to the industrial might of the Hellcat, yes, but the ghost in the machine was the simple, crisscrossing pattern that John Thach had woven into the fabric of history, proving that in the end, the smartest weapon in the cockpit wasn't the gun sight, but the mind that knew how to turn a disadvantage into a death trap. The simple scissor had cut the wings off the rising sun.